A warming Pacific Ocean thousands of miles away has once again become a source of anxiety across the American Southwest. Reservoir managers, farmers, hydropower operators, city planners, and millions of residents who depend on the Colorado River are watching the tropics closely because the rise of a strong El Niño can alter the fate of the region's most important water system within a single winter. Heavy mountain snow can refill streams that feed the Colorado River. Atmospheric rivers can bury the Rocky Mountains beneath layers of snowpack. Reservoir levels can rebound faster than expected. Yet another possibility hangs over the conversation just as heavily. A powerful El Niño can also fail to deliver where it matters most, arrive unevenly across the basin, or simply come too late to reverse years of accumulated losses. Lake Powell and Lake Mead now sit at the center of that uncertainty. On the ground, the numbers are still tight. In the Bureau of Reclamation's May 18th weekly update, Lake Powell stood at 3,527.15 feet, or 1,075.1 meters, with 5,669,000 acre-feet of water in storage and a fill level of 24%. Lake Mead stood at 1,052.49 feet, or 320.8 meters, with 7,864,000 acre-feet in storage and a fill level of 30%. The total Colorado River system contents were listed at 20,357,000 acre-feet, or about 25.11 billion cubic meters, down from 23,384,000 acre-feet, or about 28.84 billion cubic meters at the same point last year. In other words, the system is not entering this period from a place of comfort. It is entering from a place of stress. The climate signal itself is moving in a direction that deserves attention, but not overconfidence. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center says El Niño has an 82% chance of emerging in May through July 2026, and a 96% chance of continuing through Northern Hemisphere winter 2026 through 2027. At the same time, NOAA also says there is still substantial uncertainty in how strong the event will become, and no strength category exceeds a 37% chance. That matters because headlines can make Super El Niño sound like a fixed outcome when the official forecast is still probabilistic. The Pacific is trending warmer, but the strength, timing, and downstream effects are not locked in. Even when El Niño develops, its influence is seasonal rather than automatic. NOAAclimate.gov notes that El Niño and La Niña have weaker impacts during Northern Hemisphere summer than they do in winter. That means a developing El Niño does not instantly translate into a reservoir rescue. The critical question is not simply whether the Pacific warms, but whether the winter storm track delivers moisture to the right parts of the basin, in the right months, in the right form, and in enough quantity to become mountain snowpack rather than brief runoff or storms that miss the headwaters. Stronger El Niño events can make certain impacts more likely, but they do not guarantee them. The basin still lives and dies by where the precipitation actually falls. That is where the present hydrology becomes hard to ignore. Reclamation's weekly update says the overall Colorado River Basin snow accumulation above Lake Powell was just 2.5 inches as of May 4th, which was 23% of the 30-year median for that date. The report also says water year 2026. Precipitation to date in the upper basin was 17.4 inches, or 82% of normal, and current snowpack was only 1.0 inches, or 17% of normal. Lake Powell's unregulated inflow forecast for water year 2026 was 3,271,000 acre-feet, or about 4.035 billion cubic meters, which is 34% of normal. The forecast for April through July was even lower, 800,000 acre-feet, or about 986 million cubic meters, which is only 13% of normal. That is the backdrop against which any El Niño must operate. A stronger Pacific pattern can shift probabilities, but it cannot erase a weak snowpack already sitting in the basin. Reclamation has responded with a set of actions that show how serious the near-term risk has become. On April 17th, the agency said it was intending to reduce the annual release volume from Lake Powell to Lake Mead by 1.48 million acre-feet, from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6.0 million acre-feet, through September 2026. It also said it intended to release between 660,000 and 1 million acre-feet from Flaming Gorge Reservoir from April 2026 through April 2027. Together, those actions were expected to raise Lake Powell by about 54 feet, or 16.5 meters, by April 2027 and bring it to at least elevation 3,500 feet. The same release made clear that no additional releases from Blue Mesa or Navajo reservoirs were planned at that time because those reservoirs were also low and their forecasts were poor. This is not a routine seasonal tweak. It is a deliberate attempt to keep the system from sliding into a more damaging range. That effort, however, has a trade-off that sits at the center of the Lake Mead question. Reclamation explicitly acknowledged that reducing releases from Powell would accelerate the downstream decline of Lake Mead, with the potential for up to an additional 40% reduction to Hoover Dam's hydropower generating capacity as early as this fall. That is the kind of consequence that reveals how tightly linked the two reservoirs are. Water held back upstream can protect Powell's operating room and preserve release options later, but it can also leave Mead with less inflow just when the lower basin is trying to avoid another step downward. The system is not choosing between good and bad outcomes. It is choosing between different kinds of stress. Lake Mead is not free of strain even before any further Powell adjustments take effect. The Central Arizona Project dashboard says Lake Mead is operating in Tier 1 shortage condition in 2026, while the April 2026 24-month study projects the reservoir will end the year above 1,050 feet. That does not mean the lake is healthy. It means the system is being managed within shortage rules that already reflect scarcity. The same dashboard says Powell is operating in the mid-elevation release tier in water year 2026. Those are procedural labels, but behind them is a simple fact. The river is being run under shortage logic because the reservoirs are not carrying enough slack to behave like ordinary storage. A river that is still being rationed in a year that may also bring El Niño does not start from neutral ground. That is why the super El Niño idea can be misleading if it is treated as a promise rather than a possibility. NOAA's own wording cuts against that kind of certainty. It says the peak strength of El Niño remains uncertain, and that stronger El Niño events do not ensure strong impacts. They only make certain impacts more likely. In practical terms, that means a stronger event may increase the odds of a wetter winter in some parts of the Southwest, but it does not guarantee that the upper Colorado Basin will receive enough mountain precipitation to reverse the current storage trend. Some storms may arrive, but arrive in the wrong corridor. Others may produce rain instead of snow. Others may boost only a portion of the drainage area. The basin's fortunes depend on spatial detail, not just on the label attached to the Pacific. That uncertainty is especially important because the reservoir system is already operating close to thresholds that matter for power and releases. Reclamation says Lake Powell may decline below 3,490 feet, the minimum power pool level, by August 2026 without major intervention. If Glen Canyon Dam drops below that point, releases would be only through the river outlet works, which Reclamation says could create operational issues, uncertainty for users, downstream impacts, instability in regional power and water supplies, and reduced power generation. This is the practical meaning of the Brink. It is not a dramatic phrase. It is a set of operating constraints that narrows the options available to managers, cities, irrigation districts, tribes, recreation operators, and power planners. Once a reservoir gets close to those lines, every seasonal forecast becomes more consequential. The hydropower piece also deserves attention because it is easy to underestimate how much the reservoirs support electricity as well as water delivery. Reclamation says the Colorado River system supplies water and power to a region serving more than 40 million people and supports agricultural, hydropower, tribal, wildlife, and recreational uses. In the April 17th release, the agency noted that the proposed reduced releases from Powell could accelerate Mead's decline while also putting Hoover Dam's hydropower generation at risk. The May 18th weekly report showed system contents at 35% of capacity, compared with 40% last year. That drop may sound modest in percentage terms, But in a system already operating near its practical limits, each percentage point represents a large volume of stored water and a large amount of lost flexibility. The river is not just getting smaller in a physical sense, it is getting harder to operate without forcing another trade-off elsewhere. The calendar adds another layer of pressure. Reclamation says the existing agreements that guided Colorado River operations for the last 2 decades are set to expire at the end of the year, and the 7 basin states had not reached consensus on a new operating framework as of mid-April. That means the weather is not the only thing unsettled. The rulebook itself is in transition. When a river system is already under shortage conditions, with reservoir releases being adjusted to prevent deeper drops, and the underlying operating framework is also nearing expiration, every hydrologic forecast acquires a political edge. A wetter winter could buy time, a drier one could force faster decisions. But the bigger point is that the system is now balancing on weather, policy, and storage at the same time. There is also a simple reason the word super should be handled carefully. The forecast now on the table is not a declaration that the basin is about to be drenched. It is a statement that El Niño is more likely than not to develop and persist into the next winter, with strength still uncertain. NOAA also notes that the strongest El Niño events in the record are characterized by significant ocean atmosphere coupling through summer, and it remains to be seen whether that happens in 2026. That is a reminder that the event's final character has not yet been written. For the Colorado River, that means the difference between a meaningful boost and a false hope could come down to whether the Pacific actually locks into a strong, coupled state in time to shape the snow season. Until then, super is more a question than a verdict. For people who depend on the river, the practical effect of all this is less about climate labels and more about timing. If the upper basin picks up moisture early enough, snowpack can build, spring runoff can improve, and Powell may avoid the most dangerous part of the operating range. If the wet signal arrives late, if storms favor the wrong drainage, or if much of the precipitation comes as rain instead of snow, the benefit to the reservoirs could be limited. That is why a strong El Niño is not the same thing as a reservoir recovery. It can nudge the odds, but it cannot force the basin into a better hydrologic year on command. The system still needs accumulation in the mountains, sustained runoff in the spring, and enough inflow to offset the releases already being made to keep the dams working. It is also worth remembering how long the river's present stress has been building. Reclamation's April release described long-term drought, the lowest winter snowpack on record, and record-breaking March heat as compounding factors that intensified drought conditions across the basin. That means the present weakness is not the result of one bad month. It is the product of many dry years layered on top of a highly demanded river. Even if El Niño helps, it would be helping against a structural deficit, not filling an empty bucket. The reservoirs are large, but the basin's losses have been large too. A wetter season can slow decline, but only sustained improvement can restore margin. That is why any discussion of relief needs to stay grounded in the scale of the problem rather than the excitement of the forecast. The longer view is just as important as the next winter. Reclamation says it is working on post-2026 operations because the existing framework expires at year's end. And if no consensus emerges, the Interior Department says it will be prepared to determine operations later this summer. That means the next several months are not just about weather watching, they are about setting the rules that will govern the system after the current agreements lapse. In that sense, El Niño could influence the conversation, but it will not decide it. A wetter winter may reduce immediate pressure, give managers a little more room, and ease some of the worst-case projections. A weak winter would do the opposite. Yet the underlying need remains the same: fewer assumptions, more margin, and a clearer operating structure for a river that can no longer rely on historical averages to do the job. So can a super El Niño push Lake Powell and Lake Mead to the brink? The more accurate answer is that the brink is already part of the system's present operating reality, and El Niño will influence how close the reservoirs get to it over the next year. A strong Pacific event could ease pressure if it delivers enough snow and runoff to the upper basin. It could also disappoint if the storm track misses the critical watersheds, or if the signal arrives too late, to change the winter accumulation that matters most. That is why the current reservoir levels, the low snowpack, the weak inflow forecast, the shortage conditions, and the emergency release decisions matter more than the headline label. The Pacific may tilt the odds. The river still has to carry the outcome. Another complication is that reservoir recovery does not happen evenly, even during unusually wet years. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are so massive that a single productive winter often changes the pace of decline more than it restores the system itself. During previous strong El Niño periods, parts of the Southwest experienced heavier precipitation and above-average snowpack, yet the Colorado River system still remained vulnerable because demand across the basin continued pulling enormous volumes of water downstream. That imbalance has become harder to ignore as warmer temperatures increase evaporation rates and reduce the efficiency of snowpack storage in the mountains. Snow that melts too early can rush through the system before reservoirs are positioned to capture maximum benefit, while hotter spring conditions can dry soil so aggressively that runoff becomes weaker even after decent snowfall totals. In practical terms, the basin now needs not only wetter winters, but colder and more sustained winter conditions capable of preserving mountain snow deep into spring. That challenge becomes even more serious when viewed against the scale of the reservoirs themselves. Lake Mead alone can hold more than 28 million acre-feet of water at full capacity, equivalent to roughly 34.5 billion cubic meters. Lake Powell can store more than 24 million acre-feet, or nearly 29.6 billion cubic meters. Recovering meaningful elevation losses inside reservoirs of that size requires enormous inflow over extended periods, not just a few months of favorable weather. Years of drought pushed both reservoirs downward gradually, and rebuilding them would likely require multiple strong runoff seasons occurring back-to-back. That is why federal managers continue treating short-term improvements cautiously, even when conditions temporarily stabilize. The pressure is intensified further by the simple reality that the Colorado River was originally allocated during a wetter climatic period than the one the basin experiences today. Modern operations are increasingly colliding with hydrologic conditions that no longer resemble the assumptions used when the system was divided among states generations ago. As reservoir levels fluctuate near critical thresholds, the margin for forecasting mistakes becomes smaller. A winter that underperforms expectations can rapidly shift operational planning from conservation toward emergency response. That is the fragile balance now defining the Colorado River system entering another uncertain El Niño cycle.